Welcome to the Athlete Brand Advisor Podcast, featuring interviews and news about NIL. We also have special episodes to talk about recent news, events, and anything in the world of sports. The podcast is brought to you by Pliable, a full-service marketing company, an NIL agency that educates and empowers athletes to build their athlete brand. Now, here's your host, Greg Glynn.
Thanks and welcome to the Athlete Brand Advisor Podcast. In this episode, we're talking about girls and women in sports, plus the science behind their bodies and why women's sports are truly unique. Today's guest is Christine Yu. Christine is an award-winning journalist who writes about sports, science, and health. Her interest in the intersection between sports science and women athletes led her to write her first book, Up to Speed: The Groundbreaking Science of Women Athletes, which entangles really the myth and the gender bias from real science in order to address the huge research gap in sports science. And ultimately, this book, in my mind, kind of hits not only that it's a roadmap for women and girls, but it's really an examination of some of the injustices in sports and science that affect all people in the hope of uncovering ways to make the system more equitable for everyone, as she likes to say. And I think it's fantastic you've written this book, much needed. And let's dive in, Christine. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Me too. And the funny thing about this is that it all gets back to Mission E50 here at Pliable. My 14-year-old daughter told me about a Taylor Swift concert. She wanted to go to the Museum of Science in Boston, and I said, sure, let's go. And of course, we did the natural thing. We're walking in the gift shop, and I see this book, and I'm like, this looks really good. I'm like, this is right up my alley with women in sports. And so it's funny how a Taylor Swift concert brings me back to women in sports, but I think it's only fitting that we kick it off by obviously talking about my passion for women in sports. Mission E50, for those of you who don't know, is an initiative to increase the popularity of women's sports. I will always represent more than 50% female athletes, which is why today's topic is so relevant. So, Christine, let's dive in. Let's go a little bit of background on kind of how you got started in your career as an award-winning journalist.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a fluke. It was kind of a bit of a second career for me. I had previously worked in the nonprofit sector doing program development. So a lot of the front end research and design for programs that did like economic development, youth development, small business development work in New York City. Then started a family and took a little bit of a break as I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. And within that time, kind of rediscovered my love for writing. Growing up as a child of immigrant parents, writing wasn't necessarily encouraged as something to pursue. I thought I was going to be a doctor, I was encouraged to pursue, the more traditional professional paths. So I never really thought I was good at it per se. And I never really thought it was something that I really enjoyed necessarily. It was something I had to do for English class, right? We all did. But, like I said, during that time after, I'd started a family, I had started just writing a little bit more and starting to share some stories with folks. And just, it just struck me how powerful it was to be able to share, it started, initially with just like small moments of my life and how that connected with other people and how we can kind of find community, find connection, find commonalities through just storytelling, because we're human beings, right? That's what we want. So kind of like long story short, kind of eventually found my way to freelance writing, was lucky to kind of meet some folks who helped me and, ended up landing some initial pitches at, I think my first clip was at like an ESPNW, I think, and just kind of started to build up a portfolio from there and really focused in on health and science. I mean, largely because of my background, because I was supposed to be a doctor, so might as well use some of that knowledge. Yeah. But I quickly realized it was a way for me to just ask questions about topics that I was curious about, to really, talk to really smart people, and just gave me a chance to learn a lot of different things. So, it was a bit of a fluke, but also, a little bit of luck, but, it's been a lot of fun so far.
Where does your passion for sports come into this? Were you a former athlete? How did that evolve?
Yeah, I mean, so I played sports growing up, probably starting in, I was always active as a kid, but, started playing team sports probably in middle school and played in high school. Um, I was fine. I was by no means like any sort of like great athlete, but I loved moving my body. I loved playing sports largely because of that community aspect, right? Like it was where my friends were. Like those were like my some of my best friends from high school. And just having that time together, and yeah, of course, like pushing ourselves and trying to like be the best, as best as we could play. But it was really about that camaraderie that we had as a team. And after high school, I didn't, wasn't good enough to play in college, but was still, again, just something that I've always been interested in, and have been active kind of throughout. I've always been like an avid sports fan, again, since I was little, watching tennis growing and a lot of baseball growing up, outside of New York City as well.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of baseball here. But yeah, it's always been kind of in the background of my life and something I've been interested in.
Yeah. And then one of the things when I always talk with female athletes, representing obviously a lot of them, I feel like every time I turn around, there's an injury to an MCL, an ACL. It's like this repetitive kind of story that gets told over and over again. And it's really interesting. It started to kind of come in my mind. I started to think there are obviously major differences between male and female athletes. It's been a hot topic, especially with transgender and all these other different elements that come into play. Talk to me about where the idea came from to write this book on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of came from two different things. One was, I remember being at an event, probably it was like 2014 or something like that. It was an event with various for editors and writers in New York City. And there was a panel, and there was a doctor talking about female athlete triad, right? So kind of this confluence of factors where menstrual health and bone health and nutrition really kind of collide. And, it's like when you don't eat enough, it can affect your menstrual health, which can then affect your bone health. And I remember sitting, and I was probably in my 30s at that point, and I remember sitting there thinking, wait, why don't I know this information about my body? And especially because really understanding for the first time that, for bone health in particular, like having a healthy menstrual cycle in during adolescence is really important, because that kind of sets the stage for future bone health. And so for me, again, I was like, why didn't anyone ever tell me this, like in high school or young, when I was a teenager? Because that's the point in time in which I could actually do something about it, right? It might have, you know, um, affected, how I fueled my body or didn't fuel my body, in certain cases, right? But it might have made some different, it might have had some implications in choices that I might have made, right? So part of it was like I was mad that I didn't have that information, and felt like it was a disservice, because if you don't know this information about your own body, how can you make the best decisions for yourself and for your health going forward? So that was kind of one piece of it. And then the other piece of it is, as I started reporting more on sports science and talking to a lot of athletes and talking to a lot of experts in the fields, they would kind of say in a little bit of an offhand way, like, "Oh, actually, we don't really know that much about women." And I would kind of be like, "Well, wait, what?
Why
What?
not?
Like, what are you talking about?" And again, it's like one of these things where it's a little bit of a blind spot, right? Like I hadn't really thought about the fact that, like, oh, wait, you're right. All these studies that I look at, that I use to report stories, that I use as evidence to back up my stories. The population that they're done on, especially again for these like exercise physiology, sports science stories, studies tend to be done on young, active men, right?
Yep.
And so it was one of those things like, oh, wait, I didn't realize that. And then, as we kind of went on and I kind of started digging a little bit deeper, really understanding that it's only 6% of sports science studies that really focus specifically on females, on issues related specifically to women athletes, right? Which is a ridiculously small
Way too
number.
low. Way too low.
Yeah. So, as I was learning all of this, what I really was wondering was, well, how did we get to this place where we don't study women to the same extent as men? But more importantly, kind of going back to my own experience, realizing there was a lot that I didn't understand about my own body. When we don't study women to the same extent as men, or if we don't have as much information, how does that affect girls and women in sport? How does that affect our, who gets involved in sport, how they perform, how they stay involved in sport, as well as kind of their athletic career and their development, right? So that was the question that I was most interested in, is really trying to understand the implications of this gender data gap in the specific area, and how really, like, what does that do for girls and women in sport?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then as you, write this book, you're probably going through it. Was there any kind of moment that, stuck out to you the most when you were writing the book? Like you said, the 6% is incredible to me. That's mind-blowing. Was there anything that kind of you undiscovered or you were kind of really surprised by, or anything that kind of took you?
Yeah, I mean, there were many
Yeah.
moments where, you're kind of like, what? Wait, what? Like, just a lot of surprise. I think one thing is, we often kind of laugh about this, this old myth. I mean, it's not really that old, about how, women weren't used to not be able to run long distances because people thought that their uterus would fall out, right? That running so long and exerting them so long would literally cause your uterus to fall out of your body, which is, I can't even wrap my head around like how that is even
Right, yeah.
possible, right? Um, but this, I think what really struck me was this whole idea about women's bodies being so fragile and not suited to vigorous physical activity is really based on a lot of myth, right? Because we don't study women. But what struck me was that that's not always the case, in the sense that there were women out there, women scientists, women doctors, in like the 1800s. I think even maybe before, but I know definitely in the 1800s, who were doing studies, who were trying to show scientifically that, like, we're okay. Like, you know what? We're fine.
Very
Like, it's
good.
fine. There's no problem here. It doesn't affect our menstrual cycle. It doesn't affect our body. Like, it doesn't affect, like, whatever it is. Like, we're not too fragile to do this. But yet, largely because we live in a patriarchal society, right? The men who are in charge, and the other scientists who are largely men, would say, "Yeah, no, you're too biased. That we don't believe your studies." Or, like, even though they did like real scientific studies around this, but they just discounted those findings and what those women were saying. It's like, yeah, no, we don't believe it. We still don't think women should be able to play sports. So it's kind of shocking to me in that way, that that it's not that there hasn't been efforts to try to study women, but those efforts are largely shut down, and that allows for this space for myths and misconceptions to really flourish. And then I think the other thing that really surprised me was, like, it it still goes on today, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's not something that's out of the ordinary, that, it's only, yeah, as we're recording this, the Winter Olympics are going on, but
Right.
it's only in the 2014 Olympics that women were first allowed to do the big hill ski jump. Because, again, the concern was that the impact from landing from such, like, a high height, and, like, with so much speed and velocity, would cause the uterus to burst. And again, that's just over 10 years ago from now.
Wow.
So it's kind of bananas to me a little bit that, a lot of these ideas are still very pervasive in terms of, like, what we think, women's bodies are capable of doing or not capable of doing.
Yeah. Let's dive in on that a little bit here. What type of tips would you give for young girls? You talked about it yourself, kind of in those adolescent years. What would you have done differently, or what would you tell girls now who want to be rugby players, hockey players, figure skaters, soccer players? Like what advice can you pass along from your knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the number one thing really is um, how important it is to fuel your body. Um, and I say that for a couple of reasons, right? Like adolescence is no fun. Like, it's your body is changing in so many different ways. It's frankly really foreign in the way that it can be changing
Yeah,
so
yeah.
quickly. It's changing in ways that's probably drawing attention that may or may not be wanted, right?
Right.
There's pressure to look a certain way to especially if you are a competitive athlete, to think that you need to look a certain way to be successful. But what I try to remind folks is that, those Olympians or those pro athletes that we're often looking at as role models, they're grown women, they're adult women who
Mm,
have gone through puberty, who have gone through their development and, are in a different stage of life. But so for teenagers, that adolescent period is really critical. And like I mentioned before, it's really critical, especially for things for bone health, right? And that depends on making sure you're eating enough. And if you're eating enough, then your body can actually adapt to your training. Your body can recover. Your body can perform well. You're less likely to get injured, right?
mm,
And it seems like kind of in some ways like a little thing, but it has so many repercussions around it. And along with that is really just how critical it is to have a healthy menstrual cycle. Um, you know, there's been a lot of talk about menstrual cycles in the last couple of years, but for good reason. It's considered a fifth vital sign because what it really shows is that the hormones in your body are functioning well and functioning in a healthy way. So that's why it really is important to make sure that you are getting like a regular period, and that, you know, any kind of signs or symptoms where you're missing a couple of periods in a row, or if you don't have a period at all, like it's something to bring up with your parents and
mm.
and your doctor, because again, it could have a lot of repercussions down the road because we don't think about bone health, right? As
Right.
teenagers, we think of it as like something your grandma has to worry about, like as an old person, or
She
like
takes her
some
vitamins. Yeah,
me,
make sure she's
right?
taking her vitamins. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like but it really does, like what happens in those young ages really does set the stage for later on.
What kind of actionable takeaway could a young girl or parents take away from how to help them with their bone health? What should they be doing for their nutrition? Staying away from things like the sugary foods and things like that. Like what could they be doing that maybe most people don't even think about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a nutritionist, so like I don't necessarily feel super comfortable giving like a lot of nutrition
Yeah.
advice, but that is definitely something to consider. Like if it is an issue, is to talk to a sports dietitian,
Yeah.
who is very aware of these things and these issues that young women need to take care of. I think. I have two teenage boys, and they're sick of me giving them a nutrition talk or just reminding them because like I am at them about, you just gotta eat, right? And even if sometimes that means like you might be eating, some like junky food before practice. That's better than nothing because your body just needs some sort of calories. And these kids, I mean, they're burning through their calories, especially if they're playing like competitive sports. They're burning through their calories like so quickly anyways that
Right.
it almost doesn't matter. But it is just like eating regularly. So, not just necessarily making sure that you're eating like every couple hours or making sure you're bringing snacks, which again, it's a hard thing when you're in school all day and you're in class and you might not, depending on school rules or whatever, like, can you be snacking in class? Can you not?
Mm.
But just making sure that there is kind of a regular cadence of fueling that's happening. And, because it's not just like over a course of the day, kind of your calorie deficit or not. if you have big dips during the day too, it can matter a lot.
Yeah.
So I think at the bare minimum, make sure you're eating something before you go to practice. Make sure you're eating something after practice. Make
Yeah.
sure you're eating breakfast. But also talking to a sports nutritionist, and that might be something that coaches and teams think about too, especially at the beginning of the season during preseason, bringing someone in to talk to them about how to think about their nutrition throughout the season.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think we're seeing a lot more of that actually, which is good to have sports nutritionists on
Yeah.
teams and a part of the staff and out of college or whatever it may be. Let's talk about body type and the way that a woman's body is structured, and does that set them up for success in other sports or different sports, or you had mentioned there's myths about things out there, what they maybe should or should not play, that kind of thing. What are your thoughts on women's sports, and are there any things that they should be thinking about or strengthening, or looking at their body and going, oh, I need to make sure I strengthen this area?
Yeah, I think one of you had mentioned ACL tears and knee
Yeah.
injuries, and that's definitely a big one. We've known for a really long time that girls and women tend to tear their ACLs, at a higher rate than boys and men, and that rate hasn't really changed in the last like 30 years or so, despite knowing this information.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a couple things there I just want to be careful about, because the kind of traditional ideas really then center on the fact that girls and women tend to have, wider pelvises, a higher Q angle in their knee, like the hormones, this and that, right?
Yeah.
That's these elements that are specific to a female body that are perceived to make sport or make them at higher risk for knee injury, right? And so I want to be careful about how we talk about it, because of course doctors and researchers want to try to identify the risk factors, and of course we're kind of going to look at what if women are injuring themselves more than men, what's the difference between if male and female bodies that might contribute to that, right? And so that's why we tend to focus on kind of these sex specific factors. But the reason I want to be careful about that is those factors don't always exist in a vacuum, right? Like we're not just the width of our pelvis, we're not just the hormones in our body, but we exist within a larger environment that also contribute to our injury risk. Because, I grew up at a time when that's the message that I heard. And so I tore my ACL for the first time when I was how old was I? 20, 21, 20, I think, in college skiing. And I remember thinking, it's like, well, yeah, I guess like it's just inevitable that was going to happen at
Right.
some point. And that's a pretty disempowering narrative when you're
Yeah.
like, there's
Yeah.
nothing I can do about that. So there's been some additional research that has come out in the last couple of years that have really kind of looked more holistically at, well, what are the systems around girls and women and how they grow up and how they develop that might contribute to these injury factors as well. So one of the things really is, strength training and how important that is. Because again, it's one of those things that's kind of assumed to be a positive for boys and men, because like, oh, boys and men have more muscle mass than girls and women. But if we think about it, boys and men are also encouraged to go to the gym and lift weights, whereas
Yeah.
girls, and I mean, it's getting better these days, but historically,
Yeah.
girls and women,
Historically, yeah.
yeah, haven't been encouraged as much to strength train, and that potentially makes a difference, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So that's one area where I think like it's really important for girls, especially for younger girls, to really think about. Because again, like when we talk about the changes that happen in puberty, your body and your limbs are growing at such a rate that your muscles can't, and your brain kind of can't keep up with it. So if you even start thinking about doing some training, and again, it doesn't have to be like lifting like crazy weights and stuff like that, but even just like neuromuscular training and like these, other exercises to kind of prep your body to know how to like kind of
React.
make that connection between the brain and the body and your muscles before puberty or in early puberty, that can kind of temper some of the changes that happen during puberty and some of the risk factors for knee injury. Because knee injuries in girls tend to, we tend to see kind of a diversion between boys and girls, during adolescence because of, the changes that happen during that period. But anyhow, so really thinking about strength training and neuromuscular training. And there are a ton of like ACL prevention programs out there that are evidence-based that have shown like significant improvement in lowering the risk of ACL injuries. And yet, again, these programs have been out there for a long time, but people don't do them because and it's like 15, 20 minutes or something like that during a practice. And it can make such a huge difference. But, coaches only get so much time with their teams. They only get so much time on the field, and they want to make the most of it. Like, they don't want to be doing these like seemingly stupid exercises. But again, that's something to really think about incorporating. And it doesn't have to be a lot. It doesn't have to take up a lot of time.
Right. Or empowering them to do it themselves. Empowering them to say, hey, this is what you can do to get better. If you want to do it at home, you want to get, take the time to do it, do it. All right, cool. Well, other than finding the book at the Museum of Science in Boston, where can people find the book?
Yeah. I mean, you should be able to find it online, where most booksellers online. Can ask your independent bookstore as well to order it for you if they don't have it in stock. It's available in print, as an ebook, as an audiobook.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I really enjoy what you're doing. I enjoy this conversation. Obviously, really passionate about women in sports. I want to see more, girls get involved in sports, stay in sports. That's the other part, is stay in sports, because we know when they don't stay in sports, it can be different for them. So I always try to, be able to do that. And this obviously has helped that. Very much appreciate your time, your tips, your advice, and of course, a great read. So again, for those of you who want to pick up the book, it's called Up to Speed, The Groundbreaking Science of Women Athletes. And it's a great book. Christine, this has been a great episode. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. I am Greg Glynn. I'm glad you could tune in, and stay pliable, my friends.
Thanks for listening to the Athlete Brand Advisor Podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes from today's episode and catch up on recent episodes at pliablemarketing.com. Be sure to follow at Pliable MKTG on social media to follow athletes who have NIL representation and work with Pliable. Have an idea for our podcast? We encourage you to share topics and guest ideas by emailing our production staff at info@pliablemarketing.com. We love hearing from our loyal listeners, so jump in and be part of the podcast because, well, that's how we roll.